This debate is about free trade only at a surface level because to establish whether or not free trade makes sense, is a net good or a net negative, we must first establish what our economic objectives are. For nearly 100 years now, since the post World War II global consensus was established by the liberal world order, the nearly unanimous sentiment across every country's ruling class was that the objective is line go up. That's it. That was the grand plan, line go up. This sentiment was originally tied to vague, noble notions of preventing another world war. The leading theory was if everyone's line go up, then no one will have any reason to fight. This is, of course, patently absurd. Not only does the real world contain an infinite number of reasons unrelated to economics for two countries to go to war, but even two countries, both of whom have lines going up, might decide to duke it out purely because of their line being a bit more vertical. Therefore, I posit that the economic objective of any country with a sane populace and even reasonably moral governance should be create an economic environment where families can prosper. Therefore, to prove me wrong in this debate, my opponent must show one, that free trade creates a better local economy across the entire nation, which allows families in every community to succeed. Two, that protectionism or similar stances cannot provide a better local condition. Three, that free trade has not before and will not in the future disrupt or displace the American worker in a materially significant way. Big spoiler, he cannot show that. And number four, that the emerging economic status quo in the post World War II consensus period had been better for the creation of families. Now, here's what my opponent is likely going to do. Groofus came here today loaded to the gills with data that says, but line go up. He will also argue from his libertarian worldview that any form of preventing line go up is a violation of rights and utterly unacceptable. But I do not buy into libertarian politics or the moronic non-aggression principle they live by, and neither does the average American just trying to make ends meet. Thank you.
Theoretically, just two questions for you, Zach. Has trade helped human beings throughout history? Not
Yes.
necessarily just foreign trade. Okay. Every tariff necessarily that's been imposed ever has raised prices for domestic consumers above what we otherwise would have paid. Would you agree with that?
On specific goods.
On specific, so can you give me an example of how that wouldn't apply then?
What do you mean, an example of how that wouldn't apply? I answered your question. If you put a tariff on a specific good, it tends to raise the price on that specific good. If I put a tariff on vehicles, it's not going to raise the price of bread.
Well, sure, but when you say specific goods, it implies that it could theoretically be one thing. It could theoretically not work or not go up on another thing. But if it's just basically
Maybe
a
I
yes,
misunderstood your question. Can you repeat the question?
yeah. Every tariff ever imposed has raised prices for domestic consumers above what they otherwise would have. Would you agree with that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I understand where the mix-up is. Yes.
All right. That's all. So, families prospering is exactly what free trade delivers. Cheaper goods, more choice, lower prices on everything from groceries to medicine. I think Zach has basically just handed me the standard and then argued against the policy that best achieves it. So to go further into that, imagine two people, a farmer and a blacksmith living in the same village. The farmer grows more wheat than he can eat, and the blacksmith builds more tools than he can use. One day they meet in the market, and the farmer trades a bushel of wheat for a plow. They shake hands and walk away. Now, was that trade fair? Did one of them lose? The answer is obvious. Both of them walked away better off. We know this not because we inspected the trade, not because the government certified it as balanced, but because they chose it. A voluntary exchange, by its very nature, can only happen when both parties expect to benefit. The moment one of them feels the deal isn't worth it, they walk away. The handshake, so to speak, is the proof. Now scale that up. Not two people, not two towns, not two regions, two countries. The logic doesn't change. When an American business buys steel from abroad and foreign business buys American software, two parties on opposite sides of the world have looked at what the other is offering and decided, yes, this is worth it to me. The border between them changes nothing about the fundamental nature of that exchange. It's still two people or businesses acting about half of the other people, making a voluntary decision that benefits both of them. This is the starting point of economics. Trade is not a competition between nations. Nations do not trade, people do. And when people are free to trade with whomever or whoever they want, whoever offers them the best value, they will. Not out of ideology, not out of politics, out of the same basic human instinct that sent our farmer to the market in the first place. Every time a family buys something made abroad, they are casting a vote, for that deal serves them best. Every tariff restriction barrier is a government stopping that farmer and that blacksmith and saying, we don't approve this trade. And the cost of that disapproval is paid not by the foreign government, but not by the foreign producer, but by the family that now pays more or goes without it. The case for free trade doesn't begin with the economic textbooks or trade statistics. It begins with something much simpler. The self-evident truth that when two people freely choose to exchange, both of them win.
Grufus, I want you to answer how free trade makes families more prosperous in areas that it has economically destroyed.
So in terms of creative destruction, yes, we do. There is very much a certain people are worse off, but overall, everyone else in the economy gains, and that's what the objective of economics is to increase the welfare of everyone in a society, not just a few people, not just a protected class, so to speak.
So as I said, your argument is line go up. Grufus,
I literally said that
when
I literally
thirty
said
percent when 30% of the country has had their industry displaced and has suffered economic hardship due to trade arrangements, that's not a protected class of people, that's a large segment of the population. How do you account for free trade destroying 30% of our population's livelihood?
so so yes, you when you're pointing to these specific communities in the Rust Belt, former manufacturing hubs, um, yes, I will accept your premise narrowly, but how is this being caused, right? Because the honest answer, it wasn't just free trade alone. It was free trade along with domestic policies that made those communities unable to adapt. For example, occupational licensing that prevents workers from retraining, zoning laws that made moving prohibitively expensive, for example. And these same communities were also consumers. They paid less for clothing, they paid less for electronics, food, medicine because of trade. There's real money in family budgets. The question isn't whether the displacement happened, it's whether the alternative, protecting these industries indefinitely with tariffs, would have made these families better off.
I don't think I don't think tariffs is the only way to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. There's plenty of other protectionist policies that could work, but we'll
Sure.
get to that in the open dialogue. How do you account for trade deficits? The prompt necessitates reciprocity.
Well, I'm the negative, and I don't think that trade deficits are actually a good thing, right? Because if you trade deficits, I I I I suspect you want to ask me a question there.
No, I want you to finish. Go ahead. It's a hot take, but go ahead, finish, please.
No, so if you're a trade deficit is um a simply means a country is it means a country is importing more goods and services than it exports, right? So you're treating the export as as the good, right, and the imports as the cost. This is a mercantilist error, the same error same error that's been going on Keynesianism since before Keynesianism, mercantilism, whatnot. If you go to a restaurant and spend more money there than the restaurant spends at your workplace, you run a trade deficit with that restaurant. You get a meal. No one considers that a problem. The U.S. runs a trade deficit has run a trade deficit almost continuously since the 1970s, the same period in
And
which it
what's happened
experienced
to our economy since the 1970s? Has the cost of
uh,
living gone
re-
up or down?
real wages have gone up since then.
I didn't ask if real wages have gone up. I said, has the cost of living gone up or down?
Both have gone up. Both have gone up.
Has inflation remained steady, or has inflation skyrocketed?
I don't see how has anything to do with free trade. That has to do with the Federal Reserve printing money
It
and
has to do
debasement
with a
of the
lot of
gold.
things. Has it gone up or down?
Inflation has been since the 70s on average about 2.5%, depending on the year.
So it's consistently gone up year over year. Okay. Your
Yes.
grandfather could buy a house on a single income and support a family of 5. Can we do that?
No, we can't right now. But
Thank you.
at the same
Two
token,
people, and
but the
last
same,
question. Two people exchanging freely does not dictate a win. How do you account for malice in trade relationships?
well, then it's not a free trade though, right? Because if you're relying
Oh,
on
that's not
the
true at all. You
fraudulent.
can absolutely consent to a deal that is not good for you because you are in a disadvantaged position.
So the issue with that, right, is like I said, the free trade is a fraudulent trade is involuntary. The entire foundation of the argument is that this is a law enforcement question, right? This is not a trade policy question. The remedy for fraud is it could be contract law, property rights enforcements, not tariffs. Tariffs are applied in response to fraud. Tariffs applied in response to fraud punishes every honest foreign producer alongside fraudulent ones.
What
You're
when the foreign producer is the foreign government itself, such as in the case of China, which owns much of its industry, how do you account for malice?
China subsidizes their main taxpayers as a um, China subsidizes China's the way they do things is their taxpayers are sending a transfer payment right to American consumers. They are not they don't they're not necessarily dealing honestly with us, and there's
That's exactly my point. So how do you
right.
account for that?
we still we're so if there's a deal that's found out to be fraudulent, you can punish them for it, right? But if there's because I think that's fairly consistent that if you have a fraudulent idea, then you shouldn't be it should be punished if you're lying, right? But the difference is that you're still punishing everyone else in protectionism. You're punishing every people on both sides. You're punishing Americans who have nothing. You'll also end up punishing Americans because
Protecting American companies and American producers from IP theft by limiting the things that we allow China to do in trade relationships with us does not punish our companies. It actually protects them. So again, how do you account for malice when you're dealing with a malicious trade partner?
well, so there's another thing is IPs, which I know we disagree on, but for accounting for malice is at the government level, and malice at the individual level are completely different things. Which is so when a foreign government acts with malice, who actually bears the cost of protectionism? And I know you said there's other policies that's just aside from tariffs, but who pays the cost of retaliatory tariffs? The malicious, the government, whether that or the citizens who now pay, the Americans who now pay for more goods, because once again, you cost when you send money, you impose a cost on Americans, right? You're imposing a cost on Americans by employing a tariff. You're not punishing the fraudster, so to speak.
Okay, well, we're talking about trade at a government level between countries. where
Governments
the
don't trade.
individual American governments do trade. Governments trade all the time. So we're
By
talking
and
about
large, they
trade
don't.
between countries. Okay.
By and large, they don't. It's usually
First of all, yes,
individuals
they
that trade.
do. Second of all, even if we're talking about trade between individuals or groups of individuals, such as corporations, we're still in essence talking about the economic assets of one nation trading with the economic assets of another nation. So ignore any individual arguments because we are talking about a higher playing field here when we're talking about national scale stuff. So again, when you're dealing with a nationally malicious entity that controls its industries, that wants to subvert all of its relationships to gain supremacy at a global stage, how do you account for malice when you have free trade?
So this is more of a, I guess this is more, you're trying to do a direct challenge here. The countries most economically isolated I made my ahead myself. You're trading with businesses and individuals who exist within that country, though, because once again, by and large, governments don't trade aside from perhaps in terms of, unless it's like the U.S. government doesn't really trade with the with China, but the Chinese government, because it is I'd say kind of ironically nationalist socialist country, is very much, hey, they control all the economy. So yes, they can. Yes, they trade with us. The Chinese government trades with us, but the U.S. government doesn't trade with. The U.S. government does not trade with China, and they are trading with businesses and individuals who exist within the country. The malicious government is not the counterparty in the transaction. Cutting the trade-off doesn't hurt the malicious government nearly as much as it hurts the private actors and your own consumers. For example, countries most economically isolated from the rest of the world have consistently been the most dangerous and oppressive. For example, North Korea or China before market reforms. So if trading with a malicious government is dangerous, was the trade embargo against Cuba, for example, successful in changing the government's behavior over 60 years? Did isolating North Korea make it less dangerous? The countries we've refused to trade with freely have not become more peaceful or more free.
Interesting, because I don't recall taking the position that free trade made other countries better. That's it for my interrogation.
Well, I mean, we've been in the open comment section for a while, Zach, or open discussion section for a while.
You've still got about a minute and a half left on the clock. Yeah, sorry, I gave you the rolling fingers off cam. Y'all just rolled right into it once the first 3 minutes is over. But keep cooking, guys.
Okay, so Groofus, you're really not you're really not answering the question, because the companies in China, a large portion of them are owned by the state. Their actions are directed by the state. The state is overtly malicious. How do you account for dealing with that malice when you have free trade? If we don't protect in other words, if we don't have policies that protect us from that malice, we're just going to be victims of the malice. How do you prevent that with free trade?
So the claim that all companies in a particular country are malicious is an empirical assertion, and I would like to see statistics behind that, because yes, I will concede that there many countries in China are government owned, but they're not all government owned. As well as, even when the state, where state ownership and influence is fully there, the transaction is still evaluated on its own terms. If a state influenced company sells you a perfectly functional product at a competitive price, the malice of its ultimate owner doesn't change the value of what you received, right? So this goes back to, is this malice more so referring to, fraud? Is it referring to national security? Because if it's, for example, national security you're trying to get at here, then this is a completely separate question off the prompt.
Tens of thousands dead from them shipping fentanyl to this continent so they can poison us vicariously through Mexico. IP theft, sending us goods that are toxic because they don't have jack for quality control screening. The deliberate devaluation of our labor by slave factories. The stealing of our jobs by importing company labor over to their country. I could go on.
Those are all, aside from perhaps the devaluing labor part, that's all law enforcement and policy and foreign policy, not trade. And devaluing labor, Chinese slave labor is calling wholesome or all of Chinese manufacturing slave labor is an overstatement. That most is an overstatement, and there is serious forced labor concerns, but they are largely, but applying that characteristic to the entire Chinese manufacturing sector conflates conflates human rights concerns like the Uyghurs with a general argument at trade, which is not the same thing.
How is it that inflation is caused by free trade?
Well, I wouldn't say that inflation is caused by free trade because it's not. That's not what I'm claiming. What I am claiming is that when the currency is devalued through inflation, that the goods that you are buying becomes more important because your dollars are now worth less, and so you need to be more strategic in what you're acquiring. When your country is flooded with cheap foreign goods that are of a lower quality than what your grandfather had access to because his countrymen were making the goods on the shelves, now you have currency that's worth less and goods that aren't as good. It's a lose-lose situation. That's kind of what I was driving at.
Does free trade ever make sense?
Yeah, I think if you have a country with mutual goals, a similar national ethos, a shared cultural identity, and a shared language, such as a Christianized Britain and a Christianized USA, then yes, I think free trade between those two countries makes sense and could be a very beneficial relationship.
So you mentioned intellectual property theft in your questioning. How do tariffs protect intellectual property?
Tariffs would not protect intellectual property unless there's some really clever way to use them that I'm unaware of. But free trade isn't. Tariffs are not the only protectionism measure. There's plenty of things that you can do as a government that count towards protectionist policies that would help protect your property, your country's intellectual property. You can limit what you allow companies to send over to other countries so that they can't reverse engineer our tech. You can require that country allows in government auditors. If they want our stuff, they got to let us in to know that they're not stealing our shit. And then I could just go down the list. There's plenty of ways to enforce IP protections across borders if the government is actually willing to do it.
Since the prompt is about free trade, are you implying that all of these other protectionist mechanisms, all of them are ways to or would be contrary to free trade?
Well, protectionism and free trade are, at least to my understanding, on opposite ends of the policy spectrum.
Just for clarification of the prompt, what does reciprocity look like to you? Is that equally free trade or equal benefit from the trade?
Right. So reciprocity, in at least in trade, means that country A will only lower trade barriers if country B lowers them in return. The idea that open markets should be conditional or on mutual openness rather than unilateral.
So Griffiths, do tariffs have any usefulness, or should all trade be free regardless of any geopolitical circumstances?
I would say that uh, yes, and honestly, I would probably be intellectually dishonest to say otherwise. Tariffs can serve as a short-term revenue investment, and historically, before income taxes, they were used to do so. Where I would unilaterally completely object is when they're protectionist tariffs.
Can you give me like any actual current or maybe historical examples of free trade that was not reciprocated and mutually beneficial? Beneficial, sorry.
The U.S. and South Korea from the 1950s to the 1980s. South Korea during that time maintained significant protections on its domestic industry, tariff subsidies, heavy directed in tariffs and subsidies heavily impacted industrial policy. The United States largely did not reciprocate those tariffs or restrictions and continued openly trading with South Korea throughout. By the strict reciprocity standard I mentioned to Radish, the U.S. should have closed its borders if we were saying that, taking the affirmative position.
As a closing argument, I would simply kind of restate the points from my opening and kind of summarize how I think that debate just went. Rufus failed to demonstrate that free trade is better for a local economy across the entire nation. He failed to demonstrate that protectionism cannot provide a similar or better outcome for local conditions. He definitely did not demonstrate that, in fact, he admitted that free trade has destroyed large swaths of the country economically. And therefore, he basically handed me the win on a silver platter. I did miscall slightly. He didn't hit me with nearly as much data as I kind of expected he would. I suspect he did have it in his back pocket if he needed it, but I guess he simply didn't feel the need to run it off. So, in closing, I would simply implore people to think very critically about what free trade policies have done to our country in the post World War II consensus. Before World War II, we had a certain standard of living. You could get medical care, a house, 2 cars, raise as many kids as you wanted, all on a single income. Now you're living in your mom's basement with 2 master's degrees. Free trade didn't do all of that damage to us. The Federal Reserve and other economic factors, such as government policies, certainly had a hand in it. I would never try to blame all of that on free trade, but the free trade sucking millions of jobs out of this country over the years didn't help either. And with that, I cede my time.
I started with a farmer and a blacksmith, 2 people. A voluntary exchange, both of them better off, not because a government approved it, not because both sides had equivalent regulations, not because the trade was certified as reciprocal, but because they didn't because they chose it. This is not a line on a chart. This is a principle about human beings and their right to make decisions about their own lives. Zach argued that free trade only makes sense between people that are culturally similar, such as religion, right? I want to follow that logic carefully because what he is saying is that a family's right to buy what serves them best should depend not on their own best judgment, but on whatever their government approves of the culture of the person who is selling that product. That transaction, freely chosen by both parties, ought be blocked because 2 parties grew up differently, speak differently, or organize their societies differently. The farmer and blacksmith did not check each other's culture before they shook hands. They checked whether the deal was worth it. That is all that has ever been required for trade to work. I argue today that follows from that single premise. When my opponent asks who pays the tariffs, it isn't the Ford government, it's the family at the checkout. When he asks who bears the cost of trade restrictions, it's the foreign producer, it's the business who can no longer afford its inputs when he asks who benefits from free exchange, it's the ordinary people who his argument claims to protect in paying less for more, living better than they otherwise would have. His standard was families prospering. I will be willing to accept that standard, and by that standard, the evidence, such as South Korea, is unambiguous. The families have access to the widest range of goods at the lowest possible prices are better off. The workers whose industries can sell to the largest possible market are better off. The communities whose businesses can source inputs from the competitive suppliers are better off. Free trade delivers those things. Tariffs take them away. The reciprocity argument makes it sound like it's standing up for ordinary people, but follow it honestly as we just did, it ends up with ordinary people paying more, choosing less, and living worse. So the government can win a political argument with someone else's government. And I'd also like to really quickly add that because he has the burden, or he is the affirmative, he has the burden of proof, not myself. As to, yep. And with that, I can see my time.